And here we are. All right, we are live. Welcome, everyone, to Turning Points, Episode 2. My name is Josh Rodriguez, Associate Pastor here at First Presbyterian Church. And joining me today is Reverend Sarah Birdneff. Sarah, thank you for joining.
You're welcome. Josh,
Yeah.
I really wish we would. I think we need to do like a little cut because you do the same cadence every time you say, and we are live, like every time we go on to something. So if we like just spliced it with other things, I feel like we could do a whole song about it.
Yeah.
I'll
I
work on
try
that in your
I
time.
try really hard not to have like a preacher's cadence, but I've really settled into like a live stream podcast cadence. So
Oh yeah, for
you
sure.
can, it is what it is. And then also our other guest here today is Dr. John Cahill, PhD. John, you were somewhat new to Nashville. You can fill us in a little bit, but you are a husband. You're a father of two wonderful girls, and you also have your PhD from Boston College. Welcome to the conversation, John.
Thanks. It's good to be here. I'm really happy
Yeah,
to be included.
yeah.
So yeah, give you a little bit of background. I've been in Nashville. My family's been here for about 3.5 years or so. And we came from Boston after being there for about 11 years. And that is where I did my PhD. Although I just finished actually in the fall. So diploma actually arrived in the mail yesterday. It was very exciting.
Oh,
Congratulations.
congratulations, sir.
It's completely in Latin, so I have no idea what it says. So,
Yeah. And what did you study there at Boston? Your time in Boston there?
my PhD is in theological ethics. So I was in the theological department and thinking about ethical things from a theologian's perspective. My dissertation was on moral formation. How do we become just people in our interactions with one another? And attending particularly to emotions and how emotions are an important way that we relate to one another and how we think about shaping those emotions that we have and the importance of the Christian community in doing that.
Yeah. Wow. Now I want to spend the next 30 minutes talking about that. uh, Feel free to insert that as you can in the conversation. Um, so today we are kind of taking a second turning point here. And our main sort of focus, but we'll see where we end up, is the Council of Nicaea. And sort of we're talking, third, fourth century in the Christian church. We're kind of going there a little bit, and we'll talk about some of the key players and just what they had to contribute and offer some thoughts there. But to get us going, but I wanted to say, so we have someone who has their PhD in theological ethics, and then we have two reverends who are, what do you want to call us? Like a jack of all trades, or what is it called when you're like a master of none, but
Oh, Renaissance men. We're Renaissance men.
Renaissance? I don't know.
I do like that, but I do like that our degree is called the Master of Divinity. Like after 3 years, we have completely mastered the divine. It's the most pretentious degree you could get. So
Yeah, here we are. Um, but we are, well, I have two masters, Sarah. That's where
sorry.
it's important for people to no. But anyway,
What's your other master's?
uh, I don't even know what it is technically. I got a dual degree, so it's like a master, an MDiv and an MA in
It's a
youth and
Master's of
culture.
Arts in Youth Ministry or something. Or
I think it's called youth and culture,
Youth and
is what
Culture.
it is, maybe. Anyway, um, so a few people who are not experts in church history, diving into church history a little bit. And if you tuned in for the first episode, you heard Stuart, me, and my friend Gary from out east talk about the church kind of post New Testament up to about 70 AD at the fall of Jerusalem. And now we're going to kind of go past that a little bit. In general, the framework, as you kind of get to the point where you're getting a creed, just to lay it out here, you have a church, people who are trying to follow Jesus. They've kind of gone out into the world. They're trying to do what they're trying to do. The At this point, all of the New Testament scriptures have been written, but now you're getting thoughts, and you're getting theology, and you're getting doctrine, which has created orthodoxy and has also created heresy. in the sense that now people are disagreeing as they reflect on what did the scriptures writers mean and what was Jesus doing. You have people who are expressing difference of opinion, and that is going to come out all sorts of ways. But leading up to the Council of Nicaea, there's this whole sense of people are trying to look back on what Jesus, who Jesus is and was, and what he did, and what does it mean to say some of the things that he said, and then also all of these churches trying to figure out what does it mean that we have these massive disagreements in general. So that's kind of where we are at as we head into thinking about the Council of Nicaea. And if you're following along in the Turning Points book, if you're reading that, which you don't have to for these conversations, but it is helpful. Mark Knoll, this is kind of chapter 2, Realities of Empire, the Council of Nicaea. So, John, as we kind of get going, people kind of know where we're at here, 3rd, 4th century, thinking of the Council of Nicaea and chapter 2 of Knoll a little bit. Where do you go when you start to think about the church during that time? What are kind of some of your initial impressions, and what are the things that you sort of gravitate towards when you start thinking of church history at that point?
So I think that I really like something that Noel talked about at the end of that section. There's a lot of things that are important about this doctrine that came out of Nicaea. But what he highlighted was this idea that Arius, what he was trying to argue for this monotheism. It really made sense that Jesus wouldn't be God, because the understanding of God is that God is one, and that was an agreement. So how could Jesus be God? So the really radical movement and direction that Nicaea went was saying that we aren't going to be governed by rational arguments that have come before, that are somewhere outside of Revelation. No, we're going to go to Revelation. We're going to go to Scripture and to look into Jesus Christ and what was revealed there. And then, even if it's not the easiest thing to try to figure out how this all works together, we're going to wrestle through that. But this is going to be our methodology. This is what we're going to do. It's going to be all governed by Revelation.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things you bring up, such a good point, is that you can assume malice. Like when we look back, we're like, Arius, what a heretic. He was just out to destroy the church. But seemingly he thought he was articulating a faithful understanding of God and Jesus. Mm-hmm. And seemingly his convictions were that to understand God as who God was, you could not say those things about Jesus. And so you have him writing prayers and writing hymns. I mean, seemingly he wasn't just in an ivory tower writing against other people, Athanasius and everything, of saying, well, these are why these people are wrong. And I was struck, one of the things that he wrote, one of the hymns is in the Knoll book. And so it's worth just reading a little bit, because some of it you hear and you're like, that sounds beautiful. We would say something like that today. And then you hear other things and you're like, oh, we wouldn't say that. So the hymn that he wrote goes, the uncreated God has made the sun. We might not necessarily say that. It says, a beginning of things created, and by adoption has God made the Son into an advancement of himself, yet the Son's substance is removed from the substance of the Father. The Son is not equal to the Father, nor does he share the same substance. God is the all-wise Father, and the Son is the teacher of his mysteries. The member of the Holy Trinity share unequal glories. So when you put your theological glasses on there, you certainly hear plenty that we would not say nowadays. But then there's also some language in there that you think, well, there's a profound understanding of God in there that you might see something like that in our liturgies today. It's not like he was wholly wrong about everything. There's something in there that he thought he was trying to preserve.
I mean, that's what's so challenging about heresy in general, is the heresies that we study in throughout church history are they're taking something that is true and then it's just twisting it just a little bit. So it's not so, and that's why you're having councils and all of these arguments. It's because it's not some crazy far-fetched idea that, we don't think about heresy as something that comes from completely left field. It's something where, like what you were just reading, which I can't imagine that being a hymn.
I don't know the tune there, but
was it Stuart who was telling us the other day about I think it was Arius who like wrote little jingles. Like
Yeah.
they would sing them outside of people, like as they were having this conflict. I guess maybe some of his supporters came to the council, but they knew it was like their own little protest songs. Although the one you just read doesn't really resonate with me as a protest song. It's not catchy. Anyway,
Yeah.
but heresy, I mean, it's not something that just like taking a kernel of truth. They're taking some of the things from that hymn that we could totally relate to and say, yeah, that is true about God. And then it goes a step further, right? And that's what makes it so complicated. That's why they had to even have a council, is that these Christian bishops were trying to convene in order to figure out where is the truth. And I love what you said, John, about revelation, because in any other way, I think in any other system, when you get together, you're trying to figure out what's the most rational thing, what makes the most sense, how can we explain this? And if you explain something well enough, then everyone agrees with it and you have your facts and you can prove things. But as Christians, they were just relying on revelation, on God's word, and trying to trust that even though it doesn't make sense, it's the truth. I really like that piece because I think that's hard. I think we still get into that as Christians. It's like, well, I can't explain it, so maybe it's not true. Yeah. But that's not always the case.
Yeah. Well, and John, you're pointing to at something that Noel picks up on in his chapter, but Arius was really well educated on the scriptures. I mean, he knew the scriptures, and Arius would quote them to the point where if you came to a conversation with him and did not know the scriptures well, you would probably walk away being like, that guy knows what we're supposed to be saying here. And Noel kind of points at some of the holes and kind of broadens the conversation. But again, it wasn't as if Arius was only was coming at it of like, well, I just have these thoughts. But Noel does point out the fact that there is still some sort of framework there where you're coming to it. And this is page 51. You don't have to pull it up, but where it says there's a persistent human tendency to prefer logical deduction concerning what God must be like and how he must act to the lived realities of God's self-disclosure. And just this idea of like, that is just as true today as it was then. There is still some sense where you can get into conversations with people in the end of the thing is like, well, that's just not logical. And Sarah, do you remember there was a staff meeting one time where Stuart was talking about the resurrection, and I think he was quoting from a novel. I can't remember the novel. I won't try to get into it right now, but he said in a conversation or something that one of the people said, well, that just doesn't make sense. And someone at the table said, that's the point. Like the point is that what we're talking about here, when we say Jesus is Christ, fully Son, fully God, fully human, died and resurrected, that is not a logical conclusion of how things would unfold. Right. That something else has gone on here than just humans saying, well, you know what would really make sense? If I sat down with a pen and paper and wanted people to believe something, this is what they'll believe. Which Noel does a really good job of kind of pointing at that to say, we really want to get to a place where he says, the turning point in the Christian history represented by the Nicene Creed was that the church's critical choice for the wisdom of God in preference to human wisdom. That's kind of always a choice that we have as we look back and try to make sense of what Jesus did and who he is.
Of course, rationality is involved in trying to think through that and what it actually looks like. And you see that in this council and the many councils that continue as different heresies develop. And still, if you think about the Trinity for too long, it's inevitable that you're going to end up in some kind of heresy, just because it is something that is still beyond anything that we can really comprehend. And so that's why we have these people who have gone before us who have wrestled over these things, which can help us to read Scripture and to help us to think through what is the boundaries and best way to be reading the Word.
Yeah. Well, and it's good too to not make it out to be something that's like, well, they weren't really thinking when they did this. They just said whatever the Bible said. Because when you read the Nicene Creed, which we actually in the service this week, if you were in the service, we didn't do the Apostles' Creed, which is our norm. We did the Nicene Creed. there's some wonderful language in there that you don't realize it, but there were people, Athanasius, one of the main players in this whole conversation. Noel points out he was exiled 5 different times, trying to put forth this doctrine. And you got to think nowadays, for me to say that Jesus is Lord and that Jesus was God, there is really nothing at stake in me saying those things, in the sense that no one's going to show up at my door and be like, all right, Josh, come on, you got to go to Murfreesboro for the next, how or whatever. I don't know. I just said Murfreesboro.
Is that exile?
I don't know. Where would we exile people to? That's a great question for the modern church. Maybe. Well, we won't hash that out here. But anyway, you got to think 5 different times someone showed up and said, what you are saying it cannot be, and you are not allowed to say those things. And so he was exiled and put away, but he was adamant about this. So when you read the Nicene Creed, there's language of like the eternally begotten of the Father, God from God, light from light, begotten, not made, all of these things, which compared to the Apostles' Creed, which I believe commonly we understand predates the Nicene Creed, that it was more, but there's not as much of that language in there. But there are words. What's the Latin word? There we go. More Latin here. Homoousios, the consubstantial. Or is that how's it
Greek.
said, John? Yeah, Greek.
Yeah,
okay.
Homoousios, I think, versus homoousios.
Yeah, like that understanding of like Jesus is this with this. That's a profound mind that can come up with that understanding of putting substances together and trying to weave all this together at a time when people didn't know. I mean, to say Jesus walked out of the tomb is one thing, but to say the implications of that because of who he was, that's a completely different task at hand. And so minds like Athanasius putting pen to paper is just an incredible, incredible gift.
Wouldn't it be like feather to parchment or papyrus?
Probably. Yeah, you're probably right. He didn't. But
no, I mean, I think you're.
Uh-oh. God bless you.
That was the worst timing. No, I think you're right. And this is kind of tangential, but when I'm a pastor's kid and grew up in the church, and I remember when Dad would choose the Nicene Creed for us to recite or to profess our faith rather than the Apostles' Creed. And I was always just like, this is so redundant. Like I was like, God of God, light of light, very God of very God, like just try, I'm like, we get it. But that the creed came out of such a contentious time that they're like, no, there is no mistaking this. This is what we believe. And so I appreciate it more. But as a kid, I was so annoyed by the repetitive nature of it.
Yeah. So the other thing that happens, and sort of the reason that this comes about, and this is the other part of the conversation, was not just that there were people, you have Arius saying there's God the Father who made Jesus, but Jesus is not equal. And you have Athanasius saying, no, Jesus is absolutely equal with God the Father. And they're going to put forth that. At the same time, you have a Roman emperor, Constantine, who is now going to profess the faith and now going to credit the faith for, a battle win. And he's going to say, okay, it's now not just legal, we're not going to persecute Christians anymore, which had been done during the kind of the era of the martyrs. And I know people are still martyred, but in history, there was a season of that. But then Constantine even kind of props it up and says, this is going to be a thing. And so that's a huge shift in terms of everyone in the New Testament not really having much power and not really thinking they're ever going to have any power in society. They're kind of, peasants and fishermen and whatever. You have some people of influence, but it's certainly not where the faith is functioning from. Then you have Constantine coming in, a person of, ultimate power, quote unquote, saying this is the truth. It is going to prop it up as this is what we all need to believe. And there's all sorts of messy implications there for the church at that time. John, when you think about Constantine's role in this, is there anything, how have you sort of made sense of the role that he played in, not just that he was the one that said, hey, I want this thing to be written, but that he started playing a role in the church at that time.
Yeah, it really marked a change in the history of the church, a turning point, I guess you can even say. Because no longer was it this group that was within this empire, but on the margins of the empire, and that the government, for the most part, wouldn't really care about any of their inner workings.
Yeah.
To now the government having an invested interest in the role of Christianity, and that interest being that wanted to bring together the unity of the empire. So, like his predecessor, Constantine had a very similar thing, just that instead of using paganism, he was looking to Christianity to be that piece that would bring the empire together and would help him to retain his power. So it definitely brought in a different dimension to the church, and a new political factors that had to deal with and to maneuver. And so we have this interesting relation for much of history since then between governments and states and the church, and has changed a little bit over time, and until I guess kind of recently here in the West, Christianity has very much been at the center of power, and still is in very much many ways is, although it's much more pluralist than it has been.
Yeah. It's to get a little bit into the nitty gritty, because it becomes pretty fascinating to think through. You have one school of thought saying Jesus is made from God, in the sense that that de-elevates him from what the creed puts forth, and in doing so, it allows the emperor to still maintain this sort of this status of, divinely, I sit higher than Jesus in some form or fashion in my relationship to the church. So you can't, because you have all these bishops who are saying, well, no, if we're going to go the Athanasius route and saying, no, Jesus is higher than that, then anyone who's interacting on that level is going to say these emperors are down a notch. And maybe Constantine was aware of the implications, but certainly after that, when Athanasius starts being exiled, there's this implication of, if Jesus is higher than me, then I have to be subject to a bishop that represents him on earth. Well, that doesn't sound great to a Roman emperor. And there's even the story where one of the bishops, Ambrose, says, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but essentially there's a dispute of Theodosius's conduct towards a subject colony, and Ambrose refuses to allow Theodosius to take part in communion, which, when you have a bishop saying you can't take communion, Roman emperor, that interaction is going to, the power dynamic there becomes a huge implication of a theological doctrine, which you can only imagine the disputes at that time. Roman emperors, if they just off with your head, I suppose, they don't have to put up with that sort of act. But it's complicated, to say the least, as they navigate it, which we're still very aware of that today. But because anybody in power, especially political power, that starts proclaiming to represent Jesus, and all the power structures get pretty confusing nowadays.
Noel kind of talked about how, I guess, like the Father was kind of God the Father was connected with the state, and God the Son with the church. And so if you had this hierarchy, the Father's over the Son, then the Constantine would still have like some kind of hierarchy over them. But by raising them up as both co-equals, the implications going forward was that they were, in some ways, had independent from one another, and like their own circles of influence. So that also was something that went through Western history. The kind of the relation of church and state having both their own spheres of influence.
Yeah. And there's also, this isn't just a conversation about ideals of who Jesus is either, because the whole, to kind of take a step back a little bit away from empire and more about the theology and how it would have played out, because someone sitting in church, there's a huge question of like, okay, if Jesus is fully God and fully human, what implication does that have for me, churchgoer, showing up on Sunday or back then, as they worship. And the huge claim was that if, which Noel kind of puts this when he's summarizing the Nicene Creed on 49, he says, Christ became human for us humans and for our salvation. This phrase succinctly summarized the burden of Athanasius's concern that Christ could not have brought salvation to his people if Christ were only a creature. And the idea here is that you're not just talking about nuances of understanding. It's that if we land in a place that says Jesus wasn't fully human and fully man, then salvation, as the church understood it, and certainly as the New Testament tries to put forth, it's not going to matter, or it would not be possible. And so you have someone like Athanasius who's willing to be exiled 5 times, because if this isn't true, then sort of this whole thing falls apart. Which, as a churchgoer, you would have a mass. If I'm just showing up to worship, God, but Jesus doesn't really have the power to do much, or certainly doesn't have the power to do the thing that seemingly the New Testament is kind of interested in, it would just be a hard worship service to sit through, I would think.
But I think Ryan mentioned this in his sermon, is that in some ways, in the more popular, I don't know how to put it, Christianity that's maybe doesn't have as much depth, or the notions about Christianity that Jesus is a really great teacher, and he's my friend, and he is he's a great person, and he's just like Mahatma Gandhi, or this idea that even when we're not thinking about it, there is that tendency, at least within the Western Christian world, to deitize to Jesus, to focus.
Yep.
And so it's hard to I think one of the things Ryan said was, he spoke against all of that. He's like, no, he is the Son of God. And what does that, that means something, that these implications that they spread even further, even broader than that. And as a pastor, but someone who's been, saturated by this culture, there are times where I find myself thinking about Jesus as, well, he taught some really great lessons, but no, he was God incarnate, and the same Spirit that raised him from the dead is the Spirit that's alive and at work in us, and he's here still, and he's present in our sacraments, trying to actually understand, which we can't, it's a mystery, but rather than just dismissing it as what a great guy, because non-Christians believe Jesus was a great guy, I think, to them. So
John, you spent, or go ahead.
To say, he's not just merely a moral exemplary. He certainly is that, but that's not all that it is. And especially when you try to think about the mystery of the cross and the atonement and what's going on there, it is really important about Jesus being divine, because if Jesus was simply human and God sent Jesus to the cross, or somehow allowed that to happen, then that does seem very problematic, that just an innocent human being is suffering. But when you understand that, no, this is God that is taking our place for us, God as a human is doing that, it radically changes that whole picture.
Yeah. And Noel, this is the bottom of page 47, if anybody is following along in the book. He kind of says, if Christ were not truly God, then he could not bestow life upon the repentant and free them from sin and death. Yet this work of salvation is at the heart of the biblical picture of Christ, and it has anchored the church's life since the beginning. Again, just this huge, what's at stake here is huge. And, Ken Dedeen, one of Sarah Bird and I's professors in seminary, she used to ask him, one of the first classes you took up there, what's your theological rock? What is the thing that when you think about God, what's the thing that you sort of come to rest upon? Is this is the thing that this has got to be true for me. And if this isn't true, then, things can sort of start to fall apart. And I can't remember what I wrote down then, because she gives you a rock and she has you write it on the rock. Do you remember this, Sarah?
Mm-mm.
Did you? Oh, maybe.
This is
Well,
a
you
different
took the
class.
Did you take this? Did you take a class with Kenda?
Yes, but they were
Oh,
like,
okay.
it wasn't like foundation. No, some,
Okay.
but go
Anyway,
ahead.
so I don't know. People write all sorts of stuff: love, peace, resurrection, the cross, atonement. There's all sorts of things. But the farther away I've gotten from that exercise, the more I've realized that really, if you listen, they always say every preacher has the same sermon. And I honestly think at the end of the day, the same sermon I preach any given time is transformation because of Christ's resurrection. And I remember thinking, the more I've studied Jesus and church history and anything, I think my experience in the faith has been such a transformed life, and that has come seemingly only possible because of Christ's resurrection. I just can't. Anytime something bumps up against us, it says, "Well, Christ isn't really." I have a hard time even allowing that to get past. I have to maintain the non-anxious presence as a pastor, or as just someone in conversation to allow myself to think through it, because it just seems so counter to my story of actually coming to faith. Is that like, no, because he raised, I live, I'm a different human being, I'm a new creation. And so when you start thinking like that, some of this theological conversation and church history conversation, it feels different than just, well, that's the creed they wrote. What do you want me to say about it? But it seems to have more teeth than that in the person walking every day. And honestly, getting behind some of these words to know what was at stake then and what's at stake now, it feels really important to the person of faith, the person of any faith, of genuine faith, besides the just moral exemplar Jesus of, I really like how kind that guy was. It just doesn't quite get us there. So we're kind of coming to the end of the conversation. John, we've gone every which way for the past 30 minutes or so. But is there somewhere you want to direct us before we finish here in the conversation around some of this stuff, or maybe just a personal reflection on where you're at in this turning point?
Yeah, I think that, like I said, I think the takeaway for me is primarily this idea of this direction for the church to go to Jesus to be able to understand what theology and what God is, what is right doctrine, and what God is asking us. And then I guess building on what you were just talking about, the creeds, it's more than just repeating them and just saying those things. We need to think about those words and like what they mean, and that's the importance of this is trying to dig into some of those creeds and understand what do they mean for us today. Some of these words, consubstantial and stuff like that. Yeah. What does that actually mean, and what is a relevance for us in our life here? And then also, orthodoxy is incredibly important, but part of orthodoxy, at least should be, is not just right belief and knowing the right things, but orthopraxy. How is it that we have right conduct and behavior? And then also people are talking today about orthopathy and having the right emotions and feeling, and what are the things that God has called us to. So all of that comes into just a right life of praise and worship to God.
Yeah. That's beautiful, John. That's also a new word for me. I've not heard orthopathy. So another conversation, another cup of coffee. Okay. Sarah, any thoughts as we finish up here?
I mean, no, I agree with what John said in terms of like, I think there is some comfort for us. I mean, so many of the conversations we've been having at the church universal, and some of my colleagues around the country, and then of course here on staff at FPC, we realize that this in itself is another turning point where we are, that there's so much that's changing right now in the way that we do church and in people's priorities, and trying to sort through what is the most important. And I think just the reminders that like Christ is here and the Spirit is guiding. And so when we look at our history, it's not just an exercise in like academic perusing something academically, but in actually taking it on as evidence of God's faithfulness, that then helps us claim that for today. Because even just today, I'm overwhelmed by like, here are all the things I need to plan, and here's what I'm hoping, and I don't know if people are going to show up. I mean, those daily little things that then we can surrender to Christ, and trusting His Spirit, and that it's His church before it's ours. So I think that's just the core of comfort I get when we're talking through where we've been as the people of God.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is we're still in the 3rd, 4th century in our studies here. This is episode 2, second point. There's a lot more church history to go that's going to give us a lot to think through, and I think a lot of trajectory setting. Because Sarah, I think anybody writing about the church in 50 to 100 years will certainly write about this pandemic or what we're experiencing now as a turning point. And so I'm sort of fascinated to wonder looking back and wondering what God has been up to in time and space, and experiencing what we are now, how is that shaping where we're headed? And so we'll keep bringing that up in each episode here. Thursdays at noon, we have 4 more of these, and we'll have some more guests with us talking. John, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you.
Thanks for having me. It's fun.
Yeah. And Sarah, of course, thank you as always. I believe Stuart will be back with me next week, but he needed to take a little time off this week. So listeners, tune in next week, Thursday at noon. We'll have another conversation on the next little bit of this study. But also, if you're not watching this live, it will be up on the First Pres podcast on Spotify. You can find the audio there as well. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful, blessed day, and we will see you all soon.